When my son came back from the army, I realized how much he longed for something he had missed for far too long. And without even noticing, I tried to give it back to him, this simple feeling of home. The day Luke returned, the sky was low and heavy, a stretch of gray while threatening rain. I stood by the window, arms crossed tightly against my chest, feeling the seconds crawl by. It had been 3 long years since he left, 3 years filled with silence, worry, and letters that said too little about too much. When the car pulled into the driveway, I almost didn't recognize him. He stepped out slowly, slinging a weathered duffel bag over one shoulder. His figure was taller, broader, his steps steady but cautious, as though he wasn't sure he belonged here anymore. His face was harder somehow, the open boyishness replaced by something quieter, more measured. The easy laughter that used to light up his eyes now seemed buried deep, flickering like a candle in the distance. When I opened the door, I meant to greet him with a bright smile, a welcome that would sweep away the years between us. But my throat tightened, and all I could do was reach out and pull him into a fierce hug. He held me, his arms strong and sure, the hug lasting a heartbeat longer than habit dictated. Or maybe it was just that I noticed the way he clung to me, as if anchoring himself against the storm of returning. "Come inside," I managed to say, stepping back with a trembling breath. He followed, tracking the smell of rain-soaked earth into the house. I closed the door behind him, shutting out the cold, shutting out the years he had spent away. For a moment, we just stood there, surrounded by the familiar hallways and the faint ticking of the clock, strangers inhabiting the same memories. "You look good," I said finally, the words thin but heartfelt. He gave a small, rough chuckle, the sound of someone not used to laughter anymore. "You haven't changed," he said, and though I knew it wasn't true, I let myself believe him. Time had drawn fine lines around my eyes, etched weariness at the corners of my mouth. But somehow, hearing it from him warmed a corner of me I thought had frozen over. We moved into the kitchen, where the same old oak table waited, the one he used to do homework at, the one we had painted with 1,000 spilled memories. Dinner was a quiet affair. I served roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, the kind of meal I used to make on Sundays when he was little. He ate slowly, carefully, offering up pieces of his time away, deserts stretching farther than sight, nights filled with endless noise, faces of friends he didn't name. He spoke with caution, choosing each word as if it carried weight. And in between the stories, I saw it. The way his hand would tremble just slightly when he reached for his glass. The way his eyes flicked toward the window at the sound of a passing car. Small signs that the world he had lived in had not left him untouched. He was here. But parts of him were still somewhere out there, lost in dust and gunfire. Watching him, an ache bloomed deep inside me, an ancient, protective tenderness that had no words. He needed more than a roof over his head. He needed a home, and I needed to remember how to give it to him. The days began to slip into a rhythm. Luke slept in most mornings, his face slack with the exhaustion of long nights haunted by dreams he wouldn't speak of. I cooked breakfasts, pancakes, eggs, thick slices of buttered toast, but most of the time he only picked at them, offering me apologetic smiles. We spent long afternoons wrapped in the kind of silence that felt almost comfortable. Sometimes we watched old black and white movies, sitting at opposite ends of the couch, the screen flickering between us. Other days, he followed me out to the garden, helping me pull weeds or trim the bushes, silent but steady. And sometimes, when the loneliness grew too thick to breathe, we'd bake pies together, flour dusting the air like soft, forgiving snow. At first, the touches were easy, almost forgettable. A hand brushing mine as he passed a dish, his palm resting lightly against my back to guide me through the narrow kitchen. Normal, everyday gestures. But soon, those moments began to linger. Sometimes I'd find his gaze resting on me longer than necessary, thoughtful and searching. And sometimes, despite myself, I'd let my own eyes trace the changes in him, the way strength had settled into his frame, the calm steadiness in his movements, the small, unfamiliar scar just above his brow. I told myself it was pride. I told myself it was nostalgia. But late at night, when the world shrank down to my bed and the ticking clock, I knew better. Something between us had cracked under the weight of absence and need. One evening, the storm arrived. It rolled over the horizon with a low growl, darkening the sky until the world looked carved out of charcoal. Rain hammered the windows, and the power flickered before surrendering altogether. I found him in the kitchen, a flashlight casting strange shadows across his face. "Looks like we'll be camping inside tonight," he joked, a weary half-smile on his lips. We lit candles, their flickering glow painting gold onto the familiar walls. We made sandwiches, laughing quietly at our own clumsiness in the dark. We played cards by the fire, the soft crackle and hiss filling the spaces where words weren't needed. When the wind howled against the house, rattling the windows, he shifted closer. "Come here," he said, holding out a hand without thinking. It wasn't about fear. It was about needing to know the world was still holding together. I took it. We sat on the couch, a worn blanket draped across our shoulders, shielding us from the storm and from the things we dared not name. His arm rested around me, easy and natural, the steady beat of his heart under my ear a lullaby I hadn't known I missed. "I missed you," he murmured, his voice cracking. Tears stung the back of my eyes. I squeezed my own arms tighter around me, willing the feeling away. "I missed you too," I whispered. We stayed like that, wrapped in warmth against the cold chaos outside, until the fire burned low and the candles sputtered. And somewhere in the silence, something final shifted. His chest brushed lightly against my back, the brief contact sending a ripple of warmth across my skin. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice roughened by fatigue, his breath stirring the tiny hairs at the back of my neck. I nodded mutely, unable to find words, focusing instead on the swirling broth in front of me, though my hands trembled ever so slightly. Later that night, as I folded laundry in the living room under the soft glow of a side lamp, Luke lounged on the couch nearby. His long legs stretched out, and he watched me with a quiet, almost protective expression that made me fumble a towel onto the floor. He was at my side instantly, crouching to retrieve it, his fingers grazing mine as he handed it back. "You don't have to do everything alone anymore," he said, his voice low, carrying a weight that felt heavier than simple kindness. I smiled, small and wistful, understanding that he meant more than just the chores. Understanding, too, that I was already standing at the edge of something I wasn't sure I could step away from. Winter arrived earlier than usual that year, blanketing the world outside in soft silence. Snow clung to the trees like lace, muffling every sound, turning our small house into an island adrift in a sea of white. Trapped together indoors, we found simple ways to pass the time. We played endless rounds of cards by the fire, our laughter soft and easy. We read worn books aloud to each other, voices low and steady. We baked batches of cookies, often burning them at the edges because we were too busy talking to mind the timer. And always, the small, innocent touches became more frequent. A hand resting lightly against my back as he passed by. A knee brushing against mine beneath the dining table and lingering longer than necessary. A glance across a shared space that lasted just a heartbeat too long. During a game of chess one snowy evening, our fingers tangled over the same piece. For a suspended moment, neither of us moved. The fireplace crackled, the only sound in a house wrapped in frozen stillness. Outside the windows, the world had become a soft, endless blur of gray and white. Inside, the air thickened with words left unspoken. I pulled away at last, laughing too brightly, excusing myself to make tea, my heart pounding harder than any excuse could cover. He let me go, but the look he gave me, the deep, unguarded sadness, followed me into the kitchen and stayed with me long after. One sleepless night, restless and uneasy, I wandered downstairs. The house was dark and still, the fire in the hearth little more than a bed of dying embers. Luke was there, sitting on the floor by the couch, knees drawn up, his silhouette haloed by the faint glow of the firelight. When he looked up and saw me, something softened in his expression. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his voice roughened by exhaustion and something heavier, more worn. I shook my head silently. Without thinking, I crossed the room and sank down beside him, the couch behind us and the hearth before us, offering a fragile sense of shelter from the vast emptiness of night. For a long while, we said nothing. We simply sat, listening to the crackle of dying firewood, the mournful whistle of wind slipping around the corners of the house. "It's hard," he said eventually, voice barely above a whisper, his eyes fixed on the faint glow of the hearth. Coming back and finding everything familiar, but feeling like a stranger. I turned to him, my chest tightening. "You're home now," I said softly, praying the words could make it true, could sew him back together where he had been broken. He smiled faintly, a small, weary curve of his lips, and reached out for my hand. I let him take it. His fingers wove through mine, steady and grounding. A small act of trust, a silent need answered. We sat there, side by side, tangled in the quiet, two people clinging to the same fragile raft of memory and belonging. When I leaned my head lightly against his shoulder, he did not move away. When he shifted closer, pressing his side more firmly against mine, I stayed where I was. I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of him, snow, smoke, and the lingering trace of soap, and I understood. The line we had drawn between ourselves had already blurred into nothing. It was only a matter of time before gravity pulled us the rest of the way. It happened on another stormy night, when the world outside felt ready to split open at the seams. Wind battered the windows, bending the trees until they groaned in protest. Rain lashed the roof in sharp, angry bursts. The fire struggled to keep its fragile flame alive. I should have gone upstairs. I should have sought the solitude of my cold bed and buried myself in blankets and denial. But I didn't. Instead, I wrapped myself in an old blanket and curled up in the corner of the couch, watching the fire dwindle, feeling the storm seep into my bones. And then Luke appeared. He hesitated at the threshold of the room, his figure outlined by a flicker of lightning, the shadows chasing across his face. For a long moment, he stood there, silent, uncertain. Then he crossed the space between us and sat down beside me, his movements slow, careful. Without speaking, he lifted the edge of the blanket and pulled it over his own shoulders, closing the distance between us until we were hidden together, breathing the same heavy air. Our knees touched under the cover. Our shoulders brushed. The heat between us was almost unbearable. A log in the hearth cracked loudly, making me startle, and I instinctively shifted. Closer to him, not away. His hand found mine under the blanket, tentative at first, fingertips grazing my knuckles. When I didn't pull away, he took my hand fully, lacing our fingers together in a firm, steady grip. I could have ended it there. I could have untangled my hand, stood up, walked away. But I didn't. I squeezed back. Because somewhere deep inside, I needed him too. Needed to feel connected to something real, something human, something that remembered how to hold on when everything else seemed determined to fall apart. He turned toward me slowly. I mirrored the movement, drawn to him by a force larger than either of us. Our foreheads touched first, a soft, tentative connection that sent a shudder through my entire body. I closed my eyes, felt his breath on my skin. A low, shuddering breath escaped him, and then, with devastating gentleness, he brushed his lips against my temple. Soft, tentative, fragile. I felt the slight hitch in his breath as he paused, giving me one last silent chance to pull away, to stop the tide rising between us. I didn't. Instead, I stayed rooted there, breathing the same heavy air, feeling the way the storm outside seemed to mirror the one inside me. He pressed a gentle kiss to my temple, a touch so fleeting it could have been imagined. Still, I stayed. Still, I leaned into him. His forehead rested against mine, our breaths mingling, and in that trembling stillness, something fragile yet unstoppable began to break loose inside me. When he finally brushed his lips against the corner of my mouth, barely a whisper of a kiss, it carried more sorrow and tenderness than anything words could have conveyed. I should have turned away. I should have rebuilt the walls between us. But I didn't, because in that moment, in that aching silence, we both understood it was already too late. When our mouths met fully, it wasn't fiery or reckless. It was hesitant, trembling with everything we were afraid to admit. It wasn't about passion. It wasn't about rebellion. It was about survival. A desperate, shuddering attempt to cling to something warm, something real, before the world closed in again. His arms came around me carefully, enveloping me like a shield against the darkness. And I let myself lean into him, surrendering to the impossible gravity of it. Outside, the wind shrieked and battered the windows. Inside, another kind of storm took hold, quiet but devastating, carving new fault lines through what remained of my heart. The old blanket we had shared slipped to the floor, forgotten, pooling around us like a fallen banner. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting faint, flickering shadows over the two figures huddled together on the worn couch, clinging to each other like castaways. We held onto each other in the dark, not out of desire, but out of need. Out of grief. Out of the silent, aching hunger to be understood by someone, anyone, in a world that so often left us stranded and unseen. It wasn't feverish. It wasn't frantic. It was quiet, deliberate. A wordless apology spoken in glances and fleeting touches. A prayer whispered into skin too starved for comfort. It wasn't right. We knew that, even then. And yet, we stayed in that moment, breathing each other in, clutching at something we both knew we would have to let go of come morning. Somewhere deep inside, a part of me wept for the inevitability of it. The certainty that whatever we had found tonight would cost us dearly. But for that one stolen night, I let myself forget. I let myself believe that it could be simple. That need could be enough. That two broken people could patch each other, even if only for a few fleeting hours. The morning was merciless. Cold, gray light seeped through the curtains, dragging with it the weight of reality. The fire had gone out. The storm had passed. But what remained between us felt heavier than any tempest. I woke curled into the blanket on the couch, my body stiff, my chest hollow. Across the room, Luke sat slumped in an armchair, his face pale and drawn, his hands clenched tightly together as if trying to hold himself in one piece. When he noticed me stir, he straightened abruptly, the tension radiating off him like heat. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raw, scraping against the stillness like sandpaper. I sat up slowly, pulling the blanket closer around myself, as if it could protect me from the jagged reality between us. It wasn't I began, but the words collapsed under their own weight. There was no explanation, no justification, no excuse. He rose to his feet, stiff and mechanical, as if every movement cost him something. "I can't stay," he said quietly, almost to himself. I wanted to protest. Wanted to plead for more time, more chances, anything to hold onto the fragile tether between us. But I stayed silent, frozen, paralyzed by shame and sorrow. He moved around the house in slow, deliberate motions, gathering his few belongings. Each zip of a bag, each snap of a latch felt like a hammer striking a nail into the coffin of what we had shared. When the front door finally clicked shut behind him, the sound echoed through the house like a funeral bell. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there, unmoving, as the minutes stretched into hours, as daylight faded into evening without me ever noticing. Days melted into each other, a gray haze of absence and regret. I moved through the house like a ghost, haunted by memories I couldn't outrun. I touched the spaces where he had stood, retraced the steps where laughter once echoed. But they remained stubbornly empty. His scent, warm, familiar, comforting, slowly faded from the cushions, from the old sweater he had once tossed over the back of a chair, from the very air. Every morning, there was a split second where I forgot, where hope stirred, fresh and naive. And every morning, the crushing weight of remembrance flattened me anew. I stopped answering the phone, stopped opening mail, stopped cooking. Even breathing felt like too much effort. I simply existed, wrapped in the thick fog of loss. Most nights, I found myself back in the living room, huddled in the same old blanket, staring into the cold, empty hearth as if willing the fire to reignite itself, as if willing the impossible, waiting for a miracle that never came. Luke never called, never wrote, never came back. And deep down, I understood. I didn't blame him. He had been searching for comfort, for solace, for something steady to cling to after too much time adrift. And I had been searching for the same. Two broken people reaching for each other in the dark. But sometimes reaching doesn't save you. Sometimes it only pulls you deeper. The house is quiet now. Too quiet. It hums with the ghosts of what was, the air heavy with the echoes of laughter that no longer warms the rooms. I live surrounded by memories, by the faint scent of pine from a forgotten candle, by the worn blanket still folded on the edge of the couch, untouched since the night the world changed. Sometimes, in the small hours before dawn, I wake with my hand outstretched, reaching for something or someone who isn't there. And the memories flood back. The way his hand had tangled with mine under the shared blanket. The way his forehead had leaned against mine, trembling with unspoken fears. The way the storm outside had seemed quieter than the storm inside RH.